Levi Brackman here with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining today. We have a real treat. I have a conversation with Zevi Slevin, and that conversation was relatively wide-ranging. And he and I come from similar backgrounds, have taken somewhat different paths, but he is the founder of Seekers of Unity. You should go and check out his YouTube channel, Seekers of Unity. I found him because I was doing a Google search about Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish philosopher, and his book, The Guide to the Perplexed. And Zevi has this really wonderful series of lectures on that. You should go and check that out as well. But he and I had a conversation. We started off talking about Maimonides, who everyone likes to co-opt as their own. And we moved on from that, talking about leadership and how each individual can be a leader in their own right, and whether there's really been a shift in the way leadership should really be seen in today's day and age. I hope you enjoy the conversation, listening to it as much as I enjoyed having it. I hope that it will be an inspiring and enlightening podcast for you. As always, love your feedback. Let me know what you think. With no further ado, here I present to you my conversation with Zevi Slevin. I am here with Zevi Slevin. I found you by a Google search, looking for something to do with the Moreh Nevuchim or the Guide to Perplexed, and I came across your videos, Seekers of Unity, and I just was incredibly impressed. I'm very grateful that you're out there and you're doing this work and you're teaching these teachings. There's a tremendous amount of need for people who are able to teach these things with clarity and with intellectual honesty. And this is something that you're doing, and I'm grateful for that. I'm also grateful for you spending some time talking to me today.
My pleasure.
We had a little bit of a preamble conversation, and we got into talking about the Rambam. And I was sharing with you, everyone basically claims the Rambam as their own and read their own teachings into Maimonides. Why do you feel that when you have someone like the Rambam, everyone needs to claim it as his own? Well,
Great.
what do you think is going on there?
Yeah, it's funny. They say a joke that Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, Maimonides in English, that the English name Maimonides is itself indicative of the situation because he's Maimonides, right? Everyone wants to claim him as their own. No, he's mine. He's Maimonides. So everyone wants the Maimonides. Everyone wants the Moses ben Maimon, Moshe ben Maimon Asfardi. It's a fascinating thing. There's a broad consensus that Maimonides is the greatest Jewish philosopher who ever lived. So if one is seeking to place themselves within a legitimate line of Jewish intellectual thought, and certainly people do, that's important for people, they want to be real Jews, then their safe bet is to anchor themselves into Judaism's greatest philosopher, Moses Maimonides. That certainly is a good case. I think there's also another component here, which is that Maimonides is one of the only Jewish philosophers to try and establish a Jewish form of orthodoxy. Orthodoxy, not in the sense that we use the word today in Jewish circles, but in a technical philosophical, exactly, orthodoxy, the correct doxology, the correct belief that a Jew must have, based on early works in the Mishnah. But Maimonides establishes 13 principles of faith. And in one of the great ironies of Jewish intellectual history, Maimonides is accused of being a heretic precisely for trying to set criteria by which one can be accused of being a heretic. Like that itself was seen as heretical by later Jewish commentators and philosophers. But I think that this sort of record-setting authority that Maimonides holds, both in his legal halachic work in the Mishnah Torah and in his philosophical work, The Guide for the Perplexed, there's a sense of that he's this towering, he's known as the great eagle. And I think people who have any question of what's true in Judaism, if they can just read themselves into Maimonides, then that establishes a lot of cred, a lot of street cred. So that's probably what's behind it.
Inherent in that is this intellectual dishonesty, right?
It's only intellectually dishonest if it's being done dishonestly. I think there may be many people who legitimately do find themselves within the holes of Maimonides. If they're being honest, they're being honest. They're being dishonest, they're being dishonest.
No, but in that section of Maimonides, which maybe fits them. So there are parts of Maimonides which, you can pick out and say, yes, I identify with, and because he wrote so much. But you don't have to claim the entire Maimonides for yourself. And people tend to do that. And it's kind of what I'm trying to say is more not just about Maimonides, but this broader kind of thing there, where people want to feel, I think you've hit the nail on the head there in many ways, that people want to feel authentic. And if they anchor themselves into something, they feel they're authentic. So people might say, I'm a Hasid. It's interesting because you have Neo Hasidism. I saw you had a conversation with Arthur Green, who I've never met, but obviously know of, and read Tormented Master many years ago. But you find the Neo Hasidism, and they anchor themselves in Hasidut on the one hand. On the other hand, they're obviously not Hasidim in any kind of traditional sense. So is that a similar kind of concept? And why can't we have it? Like, why can't I pick and choose and say, there's bits of this that I really like, there's bits of that I really like, and become your own thing without having to say, I am a Neo Hasid?
I think it depends on what we mean here. I think in many ways, people might see me as a Neo Hasid in some way. And I think that when you say that they're not Hasidim, I think that's a tricky thing to say. I think that firstly, Hasidus or Hasid is not a new term. It's not just a term that begins in the 18th century. It's a term which goes back at least until Second Temple literature and goes back to the Bible itself. God is described, a pietist is usually how it's translated, but more, I think, connected to the etymology of chesed, someone who does kindness. The Talmud says, Ezehu chassid hamis chassid and koine, who is chassid, someone who does kindness towards the one who acquires them to God. So, I think that Chassidus goes through, there are Chassidi Ashkenaz and Chassidi Mitzrayim. Chassidus is a term for, I don't know why someone being a Chassid in the 13th century, in the 16th century, in the 2nd century is any more legitimate than someone being a Neo Chassid in the 21st century. The question is, what do we mean when we say that term? I'm just here, I'm defending all of my Neo Chassidic friends here. I don't want them to be thrown under the bus.
I don't mean to throw them under the bus. I'm just trying to talk about this kind of concept of, you mentioned about the Rambam, and I'm piggybacking off that. In order to anchor oneself into some kind of authenticity, one in some ways is not totally honest about what that is that one's anchoring oneself in and how one is different from that.
But what is it? Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. What is it to be a Chassid, right? To be a Chassid means to be connected to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the Rebbe, to the Chassidus, and to the Chassidim. That's what it means to be a Chassid. So if you have his kashrus, if you have a connection, a relationship with a Rebbe, biologically or live or otherwise, and you have a relationship with Teres Chassidus, and with the words, the living words of Chassidut, of Hasidism, and you have a Chassidic practice, and you're in relationship with fellow Chassidim, I think there's a good case to be made that one is a Chassid. And I think that people coming from a progressive, liberal, non-Orthodox Jewish space, there's no reason why they can't become Chassids. I think that for Chassidism to propose some sort of new elitism where we have the measuring sticks of who can and can't be a Chassid would be very antithetical to the spirit of 18th century Chassidut of the Baal Shem Tov, which is very much about embracing the simple Jew, the unlettered Jew, who in their act of piety, he saw them as great Chassidim. He saw that the simplicity of the simple Jew reflected more perfectly the simplicity of God than the leaded scholar who was stuck on their own ego. So I think we should be a bit more flexible with these categories.
Without a doubt, the idea is a lovely idea. I'm just talking about in practice when one goes around the world of the people who, if you go into Mea Shearim, into some that we want to call inner city of Jerusalem, or you go to Monroe, you went to an enclave, a Hasidic enclave, and you ask them, what is a Hasid? Or you ask some of these rabbis, some of the Hasidic leaders of today, what it means to be a Hasid, then you wouldn't hear that type of thing necessarily. Just the mention of the Buddha might get you thrown out of their offices.
I think, and I know people like this that live in very, let's say, black and white inner city forms of Hasidus. If you present to them a Jew, real or hypothetical, who makes a pious effort to work on themselves, to conduct what we would call avodah, inner work and worship, they spend time reciting Tehillim, or they express their Judaism in an authentic and pious way. They're connecting to the Torah, the Baal Shem Tov. They're trying to practice as best they can in the lives they live. Ways, I think if you asked them, or if you asked Reb Levi Yitzchak or Berditchev, I think they would say, yeah, sounds like a Chassid to me. I don't love these demarcations. I don't think you need to be living in Williamsburg or Borough Park or Mea Shearim to be a Chassid. I think you could be living in wherever you are, and you can connect to Chassidus and be a Chassid.
It's interesting that on the one hand, on the one hand, you would say that you don't have to be. On the other hand, you want to be. In other words, so I feel
I don't want to be living in Mea Sharm. I could. I'm very close there, but I choose to be living where I am here.
What I mean to say is that, and I think I understand this from an emotional perspective, right? In other words, the idea to want to be considered part of the community of Hasidim, on the other hand, recognizing that a lot of let's use Mea Sharm as an example. And I think I've lost a lot of my audience right now discussing this, but I think that what happens is, but there's a broader point here which I want to make, which I think is important that if people bear with me, right? And that is that on the one hand, you want to be, there's the tension. On the one hand, there's a wonderful thing to be part of that. There's not just a tradition, there's also a community, and there's warmth, and there's real love between people, etc., which exists there, which one doesn't get outside of these faith communities, if you like. On the one hand, the other hand, when one takes the orthodoxies of those communities and one scrutinizes them, it becomes challenging to put one's hand up and say, yes, I can actually fully be on board with every part of it. So the tension is, on the one hand, I can't be fully on board. If you went to Mea Sharm and you spoke to those people, what does it mean to actually be a Toldos Aaron Hasid? Or you went, anyway, you fill in the blank, right? You would find that's going to be really hard for me. I actually can't do that. On the other hand, I like all these other things associated with it, so I'm going to find a way. And that is the way which that wisdom of how to figure that tension out and live in that tension, I'm really interested in, because I think that most thinking people, and the people who listen to my podcast, I would think are thinking people, they in some way or other have that kind of tension in their life, right? There's something which is, they look around and they say, everyone's like this. And there's this, everyone, I don't care whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, you name it, the ism. And there's parts of it that the thinking person can't really fully buy into on the one hand. On the other hand, they don't want to be completely outside of the camp entirely, and then living in that tension with being intellectually honest about it, without saying, oh, actually, Maimonides agrees with me.
I think that's where the Neo Hasid is playing in, because Neo is saying we don't accept many of the societal and political stances and others that are taken. So there's a space to individuate and differentiate while remaining part of something broader. And there's a space to create new communities within the rubric of those communities that do feel closer aligned. I think it's always an interesting sort of concentric process and journey where we want to and need to be in community with others. There's an evolutionary cost to not being in community, yet being in community inevitably means some sort of denial, repression, or absence of our individuality. You cannot be fully individualistic and fully communal. Those things stand in opposition. There has to be a compromise, a give and take there. And I think that a lot of life is negotiating that exact equation of in which communities can I feel and be in a way both part of the community and also allowed to be myself. And I think we change through life. And I think a relationship is no different. When we enter into a marriage, we're doing something communal. We're doing something communal both in a broader sense, and we're doing something with another person. There's something social that we're engaging in. And we're doing that as changing people. And I think that's constantly a paradox which we're negotiating. And it's really universally true. It's really true for anyone. And it happens to be, it can come to the fore in more traditional societies where belonging to a community is very apparent and very necessary and very obvious in the way one dresses and eats and speaks. And we live in a very interesting moment in Jewish history where, for really the first time in Jewish history, we have the possibility of being a modern Jew outside of community. And now those modern Jews who have, for the first time in human history, the chance to be free human individuals without having to abandon their Judaism to become Christians or Muslims or whatnot, they're now looking for ways to re-engage freely with Jewish forms of community. I think this is a fascinating moment. That's what I see is happening in those spaces. And I see that whether it's someone who's trying to join a community that identifies with Maimonides or with the Baal Shem Tov or with Isaac Luria or with other faith traditions, I think there's something very profoundly human about that.
What brings to mind is Fear and Trembling. I don't know if you've read the book, where you have, which talks about the Akedah. Or the
Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard.
Yeah, from Kierkegaard. So this idea of being able to transcend as the unique individual being able to transcend even a relationship with God. But and this is that man of faith, which is almost impossible to get to, because at some point you need all these other people. And to stand outside of that is incredibly challenging. And like you've mentioned. So on the one hand, but navigating that in today's world is part of the challenge that we're talking about here.
It's
right?
challenging.
There's a new community which is now looking like in that sense is outside of community, but then coming back into community as these single individuals coming back together in some sense.
Yeah, I think it's a voluntary attempt to readopt community, and community is in some sense always, as we're saying, is a relinquishing of our voluntarism. It's letting go of our capacity of our agency in some sense, by definition. I think we've valorized this, to quote another title, this lonely man of faith. I don't love the sound of it. I'd much rather be a non-lonely man of faith. I'd much rather be, with no offense at all, where you're just using these titles flippantly, with greatest of respects to of course, those who know who we're speaking about. Yeah. I'd much rather be a man of faith who's not alone. There's this great line which asks, what was the achievement, what was the accomplishment of Hasidism? What was the uftu? What did Hasidus do in the world? And which is funny because it's a Hasidic question asked internally, which mirrors the academic question of what is the innovation of Hasidism after hundreds of years of Kabbalah. And the answers that Hasidus gives mirrors the academic answers in some interesting ways. And Hasidus answers in a somewhat tongue-in-cheek way that before Hasidus, the Rebbe was lonely and the Hasidim were lonely, which is a funny answer because we think that it's Hasidism which gives us the Rebbe and Hasid. We know from contemporary academia that's not the case. So the answer actually, the humor works academically, historically. So before Hasidus, the Rebbe was lonely, the Hasidim were lonely. After Hasidus, the Rebbe is no longer lonely and the Hasidim are no longer lonely. And there's something about that. The Plotinus speaks about the journey of the soul through life as the flight of the alone to the alone, right? We speak about how in the Medrash, we speak about God and Abraham, that God is Yachid Ba'ilamai, God is the singular in his universe, and Abraham is singular. He's the Ivri, he's the one which is Aver Layar. And God falls in love with this. And Judaism is a love relationship between two lonely people, between God and Abraham, and the covenant which continues through their children with the tumultuous one. So I think that there's something about not being a lonely man of faith, but being a man of faith, being a chassid who's in relationship with other chassidim, who's in relationship with the Rebbe. And those are very profound relationships. There's a Chassidic joke, which I think is said with some seriousness, that the reason why King Solomon writes the Song of Songs about two young lovers, is because he didn't have the metaphor of the Rebbe and chassid, which obviously is a greater love. So I think that when we look at the mystical traditions, we think that they offer monasticism and solitude and isolation and contemplation, but what they really offer is deep relationship. There's a relationship with one's teacher, with one's master, with one's in the East, there's a senpai who's the disciple and a sensei who's the leader. These are very profound relationships, to have mentors in this journey of life, to have peers in the journey of life. Yeah. And I think that what we're seeing today is people who either have fallen out of a more traditional form of what we would today call orthodoxy, or what's referred to as orthodoxy, or people that are coming, as we're saying, from less affiliated places, they're deeply in need of that deep human need of community, of relationship, of love.
It's interesting because I think that what has happened when I look at it is like, in some ways, I think the Hasidism which you were talking about, which started with the Baal Shem Tov, has come full cycle and needs a rebirth in some kind of ways. And it's a bit like what happens when you have if you ever read A 1984 or Animal Farm, you find that if you read like Solomon Maimon, I don't know if you've ever read Solomon Maimon back, what really went on in the house of the Maggid, it was much more. It was a bunch of guys getting together and having the master was somewhat of a peer and a master together, right? Where when that becomes like an institution, then it takes on all the properties of the institution, it becomes a lot less attractive. But then at some point it will come full circle, because you still need that human, as you mentioned. I think you're absolutely right. Humans still need that and want that. And there are people who are by very nature just head and shoulders above the rest of us. You find that if you come across someone who's like Maimonides, you should hang out with that guy and not let go. You know, learn as much as you can from him. And so but there are plenty of Maimonides wannabes who are nothing like Maimonides. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that to be able to recreate that, but why does one have to do it? And I'm trying to figure out why one has to do it in a way in which one still has to, I guess you're saying, to have some kind of authenticity, you still have to anchor it into that which came from before while being able to change it. And I think in some ways, Judaism has done this very well throughout the centuries. We've always been able to change things and talk new. And Kabbalah exists because it was able to, like you, Seekers of Unity, you were able to find from the outside, right? All these other things which are like, hey, this is also my tradition. Of course, right? Because a lot of that influenced our tradition and found its way into our tradition. And Maimonides says that he's going to quote people and not mention who he quotes it from because people, they're just not going to accept it because they're going to say, how could you quote that person? But Judaism is replete with all this outside.
Yeah.
I think this in some way burdened by it.
Yeah, I think this is an inevitable part of religion and religiosity.
Yeah.
There's a great insight which I learned in dialogue with some local Baha'i scholars, where they told me that there's a formulation or articulation within the Baha'i faith of the seasons of faith itself. That a religion, Baha'i is a relatively young religion, that a religion goes through the seasons as nature does, through its summer, so it's spring where it's beginning to blossom, it's summer when it's in full, and autumn it begins to die down, and winter finally it seems like it's dead until that cycle can go again. And it's a very I think very mature self-awareness that religion itself goes through a life cycle of religion. And I think this is inevitable. Religiosity, if we think about the great prophets of the Bible, the men and women who were consumed by the Spirit of God, they had literally the enthusiasm, the God filled them with the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh. And in that encounter of divinity, of reality, they came back and sometimes they were considered murmuring, they were bumbling idiots, and they were called crazy, Meshugaim. But sometimes they came and they spoke the truths that changed the face of history. They spoke the truths of the Ten Commandments. They spoke the truths of being kindness to the marginalized and the oppressed. These were not ideas which had any purchase before them. But what happens in that process, to take that enthusiasm, to take that wild, I would even say, that wild Dionysian religious spirit and put it into a system of religion that can become legal codes, that can guide civilizations, that to take the Apollonian spirit, it has to be institutionalized, it has to be ritualized. And institutionalizing it is both the way that it can be kept, but also the thing which is going to kill it. And what happens is that leads to the winter of religion, and then you need a spring. And that's why the prophets keep coming and they keep saying, what you were taught back then, you guys are missing the point. The prophets, we read these prophets for God's sake. We read the Haftarah of Isaiah on Yom Kippur, where he says, I don't want your sacrifices. I don't even want your Shabbat. I want you to be kind to the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the abused. And that message, for me, these are the mystics who are re-encountering the Spirit afresh. And that's what the Baal Shem Tov is. And it's of course that's going to happen again, because the Baal Shem Tov's words, which are words of fire, which he does not put into writing, as many great mystics do not, because they cannot. His students put them into writing, and that is the beginning of their perpetuation and the beginning of their death. And it's our responsibility to constantly re-engage with the Spirit and to bring those words back to life. There's a great line from Salman Rushdie, the Muslim scholar and author, who says that the role of literature, one of the most read authors today, the role of literature and music and art and poetry is to capture that ineffable spirit of religiosity, of the mystical, and give it form and give it language so that it can not just be a fleeting experience, but it can last in words and in images. But then we have to throw that out and do it again. Moses comes down the mountain and he shatters the Ten Commandments. He shatters the first set of the Luchot, because according to the sages, because he's trying to tell us that these words are simply words of stone. It's the Spirit of God that burns inside of them that matters. And that's the great revelation, the great challenge of religion. So it's no surprise that we need a new Baal Shem Tov.
Yeah. But how then so the challenge is that I have absolute clarity in that is needed. As a matter of fact, one of my big disappointments as being part of Chabad was I begged people, there needs to be a new leader here. You can't have you need to find somehow within yourselves the courage to appoint someone new, because this continuing the way this way just won't have, it's just not, at some point you need an ability to, and reform is the wrong word, because then you're saying it's all wrong, it's all bad. Part of the thesis of this podcast is that there are truths, and part of the idea is that somehow Judaism has always managed to have that. I talk about Saita, right? We learned the whole, in Daf Yomi, we learned about the wayward wife. And it's unbelievable what, the laws regarding this wayward wife. You parade around Jerusalem, you rip off her clothes, and then she dies this terrible death. And at the end of it, there's this kind of one line which says basically it's no longer relevant today. So there's this kind of, we're going to talk about it, we're going to explain it, we're going to expound upon it, but it's no longer relevant. In other words, we can have profound respect for the tradition that we come from and still say at the same time, that's no longer relevant. And I think that I see a lot of struggle with that kind of concept in the modern day, not just in Judaism, but not just in religion, but also I see it also in, for example, the Constitution of the United States. We struggle with this ability to be able to respectfully say that's in the past, and it got us to where we are today, and therefore we respect it. Tearing down of the statues, for example. Why do you need to tear them down? In other words, there's a way of saying this is no longer relevant, but it's still, and I think a lot of people struggle with that. And how does one, and in a world where everyone's struggling with that, how do you get beyond that?
Yeah. So I agree with most of what you said there, Levi, besides for one thing, which is that I don't think that the solution is to elect a new Rebbe, a new leader. I think that the Rebbe, the leader of the Chabad mystical messianic movement, leaving no successor is very intentional. I think it's painfully obvious that, and I'll just say what the thesis here is, and for those that want to ask me about it, I can explain more in person why I think this is painfully obvious. I think that the paradigm of leadership that had existed from Moses till the Rebbe was not a paradigm of leadership that was capable or possible of moving us from our contemporary paradigm of exile to a state of redemption, from Galut to Geula. And I think that what must happen is a absolute decentralization, a deconstruction of leadership, an idea which goes back to the prophet Jeremiah, which says that no man shall teach their brother, know the Lord, for they shall all know me in those days, which refers to the eschatological end of days. I think the point here is that in order to move out of our current paradigm, which we solely need to, into a messianic and redemptive paradigm, we need to each be that leader. We need to each be that Rebbe. And I think that's what the Rebbe wanted from us. And I think there's many instances where this is repeated throughout the Rebbe's teachings and earlier. And I think that's scarier. Electing a new Rebbe we've gone
down a little bit of a rabbit hole, because that I mean, it's interesting. What I didn't really mean, like, because I don't see the Rebbe as being anywhere close to Moses or in that tradition. I saw him just being a rabbi of his community, and then a community without a rabbi or without a leader is a problem. What you're saying basically is that they should elect one. Should be smaller within smaller communities.
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that no one should be elected. I think we have all been elected to be our own leaders, to stand up in our own lives and to be lights to those around us. Jonathan Sachs famously in his eulogy of the Lubavitch Rebbe said that the Rebbe was a unique leader because he didn't create followers, he created leaders. And I think that we disappoint the Rebbe when we point the finger to others and say, hey, why didn't you lead us? And the Rebbe said, I asked you, I chose you to lead me. There's a famous line that the Rebbe...
It's kind of semantics, right? Because in other words, humans, if you find that person who can be a mentor to you, and as you mentioned, someone who, can be your master and teach you that which you don't know and guide you in ways that you haven't yet experienced because you're either young or you haven't developed that far, it can take you to the next level. One needs that thing in one's life, right? If people who don't have that and don't have that kind of relationship with others, could end up an inauthentic person who's leading is a problem. But to actually find someone who's authentic like that, and it's very hard to find that, then that is incredibly valuable, and no one would say that one shouldn't have that in one's life.
I'm not, God forbid, I'm not protesting against the role of having teachers and mentors in my life.
Right.
I think that we need to just rethink and deconstruct those binaries. I think that already begins in the Mishnah, which says that I learned much from my teachers, more from my peers, but most of all from my students, which makes my students my teachers, which begins us at the beginning of the statement. It's like this Zen rabbinic koan in some sense.
Yeah.
And I think that we live in a day and age where that is becoming evident. Within the Hasidic tradition, one is taught to have a mashpia, to have someone who can positively influence them in a direction towards God, based also on the same set of mishnayot of a set upon yourself, someone to teach you. But it's very clear within the Hasidic world, the Hasidic practice, that the relationship between mashpia and makabel can be reversed. So A can be the mashpia of B, but B can also be the mashpia of A.
That's what existed back in the day, almost at the time of the Maggid. In other words, and that's what we're saying. And then it institutionalized. It became this thing where this.
So what I'm saying is, right. So what I'm saying is that we shouldn't abandon the need for teachers, but we should realize that we are all teachers, and we should realize that we are all authentic humans, and we all have something which is incredibly authentic and unique, which only we can give. And when we stand in our own, it's terrifying to admit that to ourselves, but when we stand in our own power and our own divine voice and share that and encourage those around us to share as well, we can move away from a paradigm where we relinquish our spiritual responsibility to the leader, the master, the teacher, the guide, the figure, the prophet. And we can take that responsibility in our own hands. And from that place of responsibility, we can respond to the call of the hour. And the call of the hour is to no longer follow, but to lead. And in that, we're of course following, because there's no king without a flock. There's no shepherd without.
If everyone's a leader and no followers.
Because we all become simultaneously followers and leaders. We enter into a reciprocal relationship with those around us, where we can both open ourselves up to wisdom. The Mishnah, which is a favorite of mine, says, Ezehu chacham, who is wise, halomed mikol adam, one who learns from every person. So we reciprocally open ourselves up to be students of everyone, which is one of the great messages of the Zohar, that every wagon driver, and we would say in contemporary jargon, bus driver and taxi driver and street cleaner, is a potential fund of infinite divine wisdom, if only you have the eyes and ears to hear it and see it. And at the same time, we can step into roles of sharing that which we have, which may be even scarier, to open not just our eyes and ears, but open our mouths and share the truths that burn inside of us, and we all have them. And I think that it's a deconstruction of that binary opposition, because any binaristic opposition is almost inherently a form of exilic galuti, a form of bondage in our thinking, and we have to move beyond those boundaries, beyond those binaries and dichotomies here too.
Interesting. No, I mean, there's no doubt that a new paradigm of that type of the old paradigm would never have worked. I completely see that.
You can't use old tools to build new productions, right? We need new tools. And look what's happening today. Look at the people. In order to have taught philosophy in the past, or to taught any wisdom, you needed degrees, you needed certifications, you needed the access to them, you needed to be in the right class to have that, you needed the funds, the means. Today, we live in a world where you and I know, as we're doing right now, that the gods are asleep at the doors, and anyone is allowed to share, anyone's allowed to teach, anyone's allowed to show up and put up their hand. That's the reality.
Yeah, and
we're doing it.
And I don't think that they should have ever rebuilt that hierarchy. In other words, that wasn't what I thought. But if that person exists, and I think in every generation, there are people who are just head and shoulders above the others. And if you're not open to that existing, you won't be able to see it. In other words, if you think that there's that type of that only exists once, people who are really head and shoulders, that Maimonidean type figure, that Moses-like person, if you think that person can't exist in today's day and age, you will be blind to them when they show up. You won't know that they are there because you think they don't exist. And my fundamental belief is that those people do exist. And when they show up, you need to be ready to keep quiet and listen.
Let's think about that for a second. Who was Moses? What was Moses? Moses was not particularly gifted in many areas. We don't know that he was a man of particular stature or standing. He was certainly not a talented orator and speaker. He says himself that he's aral sfasaim. He's a person whose lips are blemished. and he's ineloquent. He asks God, please don't send me. I'm not a prophet I can't be a mouthpiece for you. He's a foreigner. He's a person who grows up in some way as an orphan. He's an immigrant for most of his adult life. Moses is not someone who would be welcome in most of today's polite society. The reason why God chooses Moses is for pretty much two things, as far as I can tell. One of them is that Moses has a fierce sense of justice. And when he sees a slave being beaten, he doesn't just stand back and let it happen. He doesn't go and talk about why it's wrong. He goes and he does something about it. And he begins his career as a liberator, as someone who can save people by doing it when he sees injustice. He's a person with a fierce moral compass and with the courage to stand up and take action when he sees injustice. Firstly. Secondly, he's a person with a profound sense of love and mercy and compassion, even on a stray sheep, which is the final act which makes God elect him reluctantly on Moses' behalf for his mission, which changes the face of human history. Moses sees a stray sheep running away from the flock, and he goes and he runs after it to carry it back and to bring it back to its mother. It's this combination of a fierce, brave moral compass with the softness to cradle a sheep in one's bosom, to bring it back to their mother. It's that combination of heart and strength of soul, which makes Moses who he is. Now, if we're looking for the professors, if we're looking for the orators, if we're looking for the wealthy, if we're looking for the people endowed with charisma, we may be looking in the wrong place. And I think that the Moseses that we're looking for may pass us every day 1,000 times in the street or even in the mirror.
Right. No, without a doubt. That's what made Moses originally Moses. But when the Jews came across him, in other words, when he started to become a leader, this was a person who then was able to channel the divine in a way in which, and obviously I never met Moses, but we're still talking about him today, right? And the Torah Moshe, the teachings of Moses, have made the greatest profound impact on humanity, probably more than anybody else. And so the point is, there's something going on there. Of course, the kindness needs to be there. But what I'm saying is there's something else going on there, which is if you think that doesn't exist today, you might not find it. That's what I'm saying. In other words, like, if you don't have the humility to realize that I am not the leader, I do have something to give. We all have something to offer other people. But
humility is the other thing
not,
that he has. But Moses is, the Bible says, he's anav mikol ha'adam, that he's the most humble, right, which is an extraordinary thing to say.
But is that the fear I have is if we all want to be teachers, and then we say that paradigm of leadership is no longer here, what I think is that we might then close ourselves off from that possibility of those people, because I think they do exist. They have to exist.
I want to reverse what you're saying here a little, if you let me.
Sure.
I think that those people exist all around us. And I think that when we create some sort of elitist criteria of who can or can't be a teacher or a leader or a redeemer, we preclude the possibility of those people ever entering our lives and our realities. And I think that when we allow ourselves to envision a world where everyone has the capacity to speak the word of God and to have that fire burn through them, then we open up a space where those teachers will arise. It's not by raising the criteria that we will come to, or by having some sort of bar of entry that will come to produce the teachers worthy of name, but it's precisely by empowering who we would ordinarily consider ordinary people to do the extraordinary. It's Moses himself who tells the two brothers Eldad and Medad, when they begin to prophesy in the camp after the raffle to select the elders of Israel, that Joshua, the Hankook side man of Moses, comes and tells him that they're prophesying and Moses needs to do something about it because they're going to challenge his authority. Moses, the reigning prophet. And Moses says, God forbid that I should silence them. And he says the most beautiful words of true humble leadership, which is, mi yitain, if only, halavai, we would say in modern parlance, in modern Yiddishism, halavai, if only all of the people would prophesy, because the Spirit of God rests in all of them. And that's the Spirit, I think. And that's what Moses teaches us. The Spirit of God rests inside of all of us. It's the Torah of Moses which teaches us that when God dwells in the people, he dwells in each one of them. To deny the indwelling of the divine in every human, because we have some sort of expectation of who might be a leader, might be a teacher, I think is antithetical to what Moses came to teach us, to what Moses came to encourage during his lifetime.
No, I'm not denying it at all. It's the matter of degree is what I'm saying. Without a doubt, we should all see ourselves as teachers. I'm combined that. I do buy into that 100%. But I also recognize that when I was in university and in England, actually getting a first is pretty hard. Right? And in America, everyone gets A's, right? In England, it's actually relatively hard. And the professor used to say, you have to leave room for the Einsteins. One can be great students, but there's only one Einstein. Right? And I don't want to get into whether it's theory of relativity and whether, but the point I'm trying to make is that there are people whom what you call shikhl mala, right? They're head and shoulders above everybody else. And there has to be room for those people. And they don't show up every day. Those people, 3, 4, 5 standard deviations from the mean.
You know what the irony is, though? The irony is that Einstein was such a poor student in school.
I know. That's why it was a bad example.
That they would have told him, you're no Einstein, right? Throughout his matriculation and education, he would have been held to prior standards of what it meant to be an Einstein. We would have had no Einstein. It's only because somehow we got a lucky break where he was allowed to express his own unique creative genius that we're able to be even talking about him. I think that it's precisely the opening up of these capacities that will allow these people to emerge. And I think
you do admit that though there is such a thing then, because there is such a thing. You said the paradigm of leadership has changed, right? Whereas what I'm trying to say, and pains to try and express, is that there has to be people of 5 standard deviations. That by definition, being 5 standard deviations from the mean, you're talking about it's incredibly rare. It can't be everybody.
I'll tell you what.
And because there's a bell curve, right? The way it works statistically is a bell curve, and we're all within 2 standard deviations, 6-7% of us are in 2 standard deviations of the mean, et cetera, et cetera. And we get way into the tails, right? Those people have become incredibly rare. But statistically, they exist.
Yeah. So I think on the model that you're presenting, what you're saying is correct, but I disagree with the model. I disagree with the criteria by which we're establishing the X and Y axes of these bell curves and deviations. I approach reality from the point of view of the metaphysics of Hasidism, of mysticism, as I was taught it, and as I've come to appreciate it as an adult as well. In that paradigm, as well as I do, that we are in possession of a part of the infinite. And you know as well that part of the infinite, by the rules of mathematics, is infinite self. As Hasid says, that etzem, that when you take a hold of that which is essential, you're taking a hold of the entire essence. And I think that we have to think about new paradigms of what does it mean to have a leader. It doesn't mean, and this is very problematic, of where are we setting our targets and expectations? If we're looking for someone who is going to be the most brilliant entrepreneur, and he's going to know how to cut costs the most and how to make sure that workers get paid the least and how to take our work overseas and pollute the planet in the process, where I have to say that is part of the modern goal of education and the criteria of success in today's planet. And I think we need to radically rethink what it means to be a leader and a teacher, to be degrees of deviation off the norm. I think we need people that are off the charts when it comes to their empathy and their presence and their capacity to listen and their capacity to show up and hold space and their to be lovers. I think we need new forms of genius. This is a religious genius. And I truly believe that every human created in the image of God, as Genesis 1 tells us, has the capacity to do that, if only we believe that they can and believe that we can.
The parts in which we agree are much more than parts we don't agree. But I think when you have someone who's the rarest thing is having people who are 3 or 4 or 5 standard deviations from the mean in multiples of these different arenas, right? In love, in the ability to have compassion, in the ability to have intelligence, in the ability to channel the divine. We all have it. To use a Hasidic phrase, we have timtum hamoach v'alev, right?
Right.
It. And so someone who is able to manifest all of that to its greatest degree, by definition, that's going to be incredibly rare. And all I'm trying to say is, like, my fear, I love what you're saying because it's so empowering. And I think One of the things I tell people that theurgy, when you talk about theurgy, and especially Chabad Hasidus has this kind of theurgy, which basically means that the ability for the humans to have an impact and affect a change in the divine. You have this idea that the bar mitzvah boy who turns 13, he says this discourse, which no one really understands what it is, except for you're basically telling him, which is a completely new concept. I think this is, Chabad does this, and I always ask people, do you know really what this kid's saying? Because he's actually his theurgy at the highest level. And, it's just from Midrash. This is a complete novel reading of a Midrash to say that this little kid basically has power over God. It's unbelievably empowering, right? And you tell a 13-year-old that, it's mind-blowing. And so, in other words, your message, and this message is unbelievably empowering, and I love it. The only thing I'm trying to say here is that it might have a downside to it, which means that you're basically saying that if everyone's a leader, then no one's a leader. In other words, everyone can be 4 standard deviations from the mean, and you just move the bell curve down the line, right? In other words, and that's my fear here. And you cut yourself off to that ability to find that. I don't even know if it's a person, because I don't know if maybe it's the next AI. Who knows what it is, right? That thing which can bring the next quantum leap, and to us as humans in our lives. And so everything I love about what you're saying, the empowering nature of what you're saying is incredible, and I find it personally inspiring, and I'm grateful for you for sharing it.
I think the next quantum leap, and we may not agree here, which is beautiful as well. I'd be very glad to disagree with brothers and friends and lovers. I think that the next great leap forward comes in recognizing this truth, which is that you, Levi, are the most rare thing to have ever existed. And the proof is in the pudding, because God, the nature, the universe, cosmos, whatever you want to call it, chose to manifest you as you in your particularity. Or I'm using volitional language here. People will have to take that creatively if it's uncomfortable with them. But the fact that you are means that you must be, and that you must fully step into that which you are, and into the uniqueness which you are. Moses has been a central figure in this conversation, so I'll make reference to him one more time, which is that when we think about the prophecy of Moses, which Maimonides, another central figure in the conversation, calls, based on what we have in the sages and in the Bible, the greatest of all prophets, the greatest prophecy, and he goes to great lengths to explain why his prophecy is categorically other than every other gradation of prophecy. And we typically understand that to mean that Moses is the greatest prophet because he was so humble, as we're saying. He's the most humble of people, and he was so able to fully vacate himself that God speaks, literally, says the Talmud, through his lips, that he could say the words, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. I will give rain in its proper time, because there's no more I, there's no more ego, there's just pure godliness shining through this empty vessel or container, which was once Moses. And the Hasidic teachers say, no, on the contrary, Punk Vakertu would say in Hasidus, that Moses was so Moses, he was so himself, he was so capable of embracing the particularity through which God manifested as Moses, that when Moses spoke, it was Moses speaking fully himself, therefore fully divine, fully God, fully human, to use some neighboring theological terminology. It's not an absence of Moses that allows God to speak, but it's a full presence of Moses. And I think when you, Levi, and when whoever's listening can find that in themselves, where their full beauty and their full divinity can come through, we're all infinite standards of deviation away from the mean. And that, I'm not going to back down from this, because I really
no, it's just a statistical impossibility, but that's fine. It's very empowering.
Where at a certain point we have to move beyond statistics as well.
Yeah, and so look, this has been a wonderful opportunity for me to have this conversation. I really appreciate your time, appreciate what you're doing out there. And I hope our listeners also are able to appreciate. I know this is a lockstep change from what conversations I've had in the past, but I think people will appreciate it. I think this podcast, I call it truths. There are truths here, not just one truth. Truth is not found in the Bible at all, except for as equated with chesed. So the idea of the truth, empirical truth, is not something which I believe that religion at all, especially ancient religion, has ever traded in. It's not a concept which I think religion talks about. It's a very modern idea that this has the truth, which is one that, but there are loads of truths within the Torah itself. The Torah is a book of truths rather than the truth. And that's why that's why I've called this podcast Truths, But I think within what we both said, there are truths there, truths in the fact that people should feel very empowered, and I am feeling very empowered by this conversation. Find the divinity from within us and allow that to emerge forth, I think, is a wonderful idea. Thank you for sharing that. On the other hand, I would say leave room. If it's Moses or Maimonides and he shows up, just
Or Levi.
But I'm very grateful for your time, and
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure being here with you and conversing and disagreeing. It's been very pleasurable, and I'm very grateful for making the time and for to be able to encounter. And I hope we get to sit down in person sometime in the near future, God willing.
yeah, next time you're in Haven. All right.
Looking forward to
Thank you very much.
My greatest pleasure.